Friends, would you please join with me in the spirit of prayer? Spirit of the living God, fall afresh and anew upon each one of us, that with every breath we would sense your renewing, restoring, and redeeming power, sustaining our life, not only here and now, but also then and there, every single moment this week, where we sense that you do hear us and you know us better than we know ourselves. Let your love be encountered now in this moment, we pray. Amen. 735. To the best of my estimation, that is the number of sermons that I have preached over the last 15 years. Now don't worry, I'm not going to recount them all today. God knows I barely remember the one from last Sunday. But on September 9th, 2001, I stood in this very robe, anxious and awkward, as I was ordained into Christian ministry. The ordination happened in Urbandale, Iowa, so you know that I was on holy ground. And as I stood there, I promised to prayerfully and faithfully lead the people of God to the best of my ability. It was a day that I remember that was filled with so much excitement and enthusiasm for the days and the weeks to come. But 2 days later, on September 11th, 2001, I would stand again, anxious and awkward, this time gawking at the television in disbelief as that smoke smudged the bright blue sky. All the events, all the questions. That September 11th, there seemed to be this communal pain that was awoken in the hearts of the people. In the days and weeks after, people would come back to the church trying to find hope, trying to find answers to those questions why. It seems to me that as I look back over the last 15 years, faith and fear have been mixed and mingled in my life. They've been caught up with one another. A few days after September 11th, Gina and I packed all of our worldly belongings and we headed out for Hillsborough, New Hampshire to serve in my first church, Smith Memorial Congregational United Church of Christ. It was in the heart of Congregationalism. I remember at that church, every October, they put on what they called the Harvest Supper. They baked turkeys with all the fixings. And I still remember one year, I was promoted from washing dishes to mashing the potatoes. Choir, that's the big leagues right there. I remember that church down in the cellar. It had a dirt floor and an old steam boiler that I was taught how to maintain. Looking back now, that knowledge serves me no purpose whatsoever in Florida, but I know how to do it. At that church, I learned what it was to work with committees, how to read a church budget and even occasionally understand it, and also what it meant to walk with God's people at a particular place and time. What I remember most about days in New Hampshire was that in Concord was where my children were born. They're true New Englanders. And I also remember the people. I remember Ginny, who made these delicious whoopie pies. And we would sit at her dining room table where there was this great big picture window, and outside there was a hummingbird feeder, silently watching as the hummingbirds whizzed back and forth, getting that sugar treat. 5 years of serving there, I can still remember when we moved from Hillsborough to Janesville. We decided in the move that we would drive through the night. And what I remember about that is that we got stuck in a traffic jam in Chicago at 2 a.m. in the morning. 2 a.m. in the morning in Chicago, only there. It was there in Janesville where we bought our first house. In the living room, Olivia took her very first steps as a 1-year-old. It was at that church, a historic church downtown where Abraham Lincoln worshiped one time. The church had this great big belfry. And every now and then, one of the bats that lived in the belfry would make its way down into the office for a visit. Now, friends, I try to give my all to the church, but being Batman, the one who would capture that, it's where I draw the line. I seriously doubt why God gave a mouse wings. I remember more committee meetings at that church. I remember that was where I led some of my first capital campaigns. I remember one of those capital campaigns was that we were going to redo the sanctuary. And the sanctuary had this yellow 1950s wool carpeting that we tore up. And underneath there were the boards from the 1800s still intact. The history of that place. What I remember most is the people. I remember Doc Purdy. He was the son of a Methodist pastor. And when I'd go to visit him, he would always look me in the eyes and he'd say, "Wes, is the church taking care of you?" And I remember 3 years ago in October when I came for an interview here in Sarasota. I remember the search team. I remember when we arrived that evening out at Deb and Richard's, their condo, and it was late at night, but we went outside and we could hear the crashing of the Gulf waves. I remember a few days later, my children swimming out in the Gulf waters as the sun was setting. And friends, I could not be more blessed to be celebrating 15 years of ministry than with you all today. It is such a gift. But you know, it isn't the 735 sermons that I measure the past 15 years by. It isn't the balanced budgets or the capital campaigns. It isn't all the meetings, because God knows I lost track of those years ago. It's the people. It's you all. That's, when I look back at 15 years, the holy ground moments of being with the people of God, just as Moses encountered a holy ground moment today. Now, some of those holy ground moments are the obvious ones. Singing Silent Night on Christmas Eve. Easter morning with those allergy-aggravating lilies, but singing Christ the Lord is risen today at the top of our lungs. Baptisms, weddings, funerals. All Saints' Day, when we light candles in remembrance of those whose fingerprints are etched on our hearts. But it isn't only those high holy days. It's also those ordinary moments when the extraordinary grace of God is discovered. That's what happens to Moses in the passage you just heard. I don't think Moses woke up that morning thinking that he was going to have some life-changing, life-altering moment, experience of God's grace. It's just an ordinary day. He got up, he slid into the sandals that he always wore. He kissed Zipporah on the cheek while he grabbed a leftover piece of bread and a shepherd's crook and the sheep, and he led them out, we are told, to Mount Oreb. Now, Mount Oreb, that word means a wasteland. Not exactly the place you would think to encounter God's grace and presence in your life. But nevertheless, at some point, as Moses was going about his normal, everyday routine, he sees, maybe out of the corner of his eye, he notices a burning bush in his very midst. And he's drawn to that bush, that peculiar bush that captures his entire heart. Now, we have no idea if that bush was burning and other shepherds had walked right past it with nary a glance. But something compelled and captured Moses' attention, and he starts to go near it. And from that bush, Moses hears God speak his very name. Take off your sandals, God says, for you are standing on holy ground. I wonder if Moses, in that very moment, could have thought what his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Jacob says in the book of Genesis. Jacob, who sees angels ascending and descending from a ladder. In that moment, Jacob says, surely God is in this place. And I didn't realize it. This place, this Horeb place. Surely God is here. And I did not even realize it. Moses is called to go back to Pharaoh, back to the land where he was a wanted man, back to encounter all the fears that he thought he had left in the past, back to face them with courage and with grace. And God says that he will be with Moses. There are times in my life that, just like Moses, I'm not always sure that I'm up to the task of leading God's people faithfully through the wilderness that we wander in this time and in this place. There are challenges, ups and downs, twists and turns in our lives, just as Moses encounters in his life. And then there are also these amazing holy ground moments when we can join with Jacob and with Moses and with countless other people in saying, surely God is in this place. And I didn't even know it. But it isn't just God's presence that God offers to Moses as a reassurance, as a reminder of that grace and love. Moses also asks for God's name. And usually the way that we've translated this part of the passage is by saying that what God told Moses God's name is Yahweh. Or, in the passage today, it's translated, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Now in Hebrew, Yahweh is simply spelled YHWH. But here's the thing about those letters. You can put in any vowel you want in between those consonants, and it really doesn't form a Hebrew word. It's gibberish. It's nonsensical. It's not something you can actually say. This connects back with Hebrew ancestors who have said God's name is no audible sound. And so some scholars over the years have said that maybe the word Yahweh isn't actually a formal name. Maybe Yahweh is the sound of breath itself. Yah-weh. Yah-weh. Will you try that with me one time? Yah-weh. What if, when Moses asked for God's divine name, what God did was breathe on Moses the divine breath? If when Moses asked for that name, just as God had breathed over the chaos at the beginning of creation, just as God had breathed into the first being that God had formed and fashioned out of the mud and dust, what if what Moses received on that day was nothing less than the divine breath, Yah-weh? And it filled him with the courage and the faith he needed for that day. That reminds me, as I've kind of paused at this 15-year mark, there are two truths that I am carrying with me into the coming years. The first is this: breathing is good. With every single breath, I breathe in Yah-weh, the sacred presence of the one who is intertangled in every single breath I take, and that you take, and that we take together. And the other truth is this, that if God is there in every single moment, The next 15 years don't have to be like the first 15. Part of the advantage of time is that there are these events and these experiences that I carry with me that can help guide me as I seek to be faithfully and prayerfully your pastor in the years to come. We are on holy ground. Today, I echo that sentiment that surely God is in this place at this time. With every breath we take, we breathe in God's love and grace for all of us and for this world. And because of that truth, I can't wait for Sermon 736 next Sunday. Thank you. Thank you for your love, for your support and care. You are a blessing. Amen.